Okay, great. I think we're ready to get started with our next session. If you missed some of the earlier announcements, just a couple reminders. Welcome again to the 2021 Summer Martha's Vineyard Book Festival. Thanks for coming. We're pleased to be here. We're pleased to be able to be in person, but obviously we have to take some precautions. Please follow the instructions you see around and leave the tents between sessions if possible. You'll find water outside the tents and at the registration booth. And if you haven't already, we really encourage everyone to stop by the book tent. Consider purchasing the books you're hearing about today. It supports the authors, it supports the program, it supports independent booksellers. We'll happily take some questions as we wrap up this session. Feel free to just form a line to the microphones here, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions. Try to keep them brief so we can fit in as many as possible. But without further delay, I want to introduce our panelists. So today we've got Adam Jentleson with Debbie Paul. I'll introduce Debbie and let her introduce Adam. So Debbie Paul is the chair of the Indivisible Massachusetts Coalition Coordinating Board. It's IMC. It's an all-volunteer, statewide organization created to support the work of more than 50 groups and their allies across the state, working to improve democracy, support policies and legislation that improve equity and justice for everyone, and eliminate institutional racism. So welcome, Debbie and Adam.
Thank you, Maya. Can everybody hear me okay? Thanks. Thank you very much. It is my sincere pleasure to be here with Adam, and let me tell you about Adam. Adam Gentleson is the executive director of the Progressive War Room, Battleborn Collective, and the former deputy chief of staff to Senator Harry Reid, where he was senior advisor on political, legislative, and communication strategy through the fight years of Obama. Described as a rules whiz by Huffington Post, Reid's strategies receive extensive public attention and become topics of discussion for senators, and his recommendations are often adopted. Jentleson's work has been cited as influencing the debate over reforming the filibuster in the Senate, motivating Democrats to be aggressive. In addition to the New York Times, Jentleson's writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Politico, and CQ. Adam is here at the festival with his new book, Kill Switch. Hope everybody's got a copy.
Me too.
Kill Switch, The Rise of the Modern Senate and the Crippling of American Democracy, published to wide praise, including this from Ezra Klein. In Kill Switch, Adam Jentleson has created both an essential portrait of a Senate and a political system in crisis, as well as a crystal clear analysis of how to save it. This is a necessary book for understanding why the Senate has become the key impediment to American governance. Every member of the US Senate should read it, and so should the rest of us. So, before I get started, I want to give a quick shout out to some folks who helped us get here. Kathy Walters of the Vineyard and Carla Cooper, who leads the local Indivisible group on the Vineyard. She asked Ezra Levin, who's a co-founder and co-director of Indivisible National, to help her get in touch with Adam Jentleson. So thank you for doing that, because that's why he's here. And I have to share one more thing before we start with the questions. So since Adam is from the Senate, he should know that all of this happened as a result of a town hall that the Indivisible Mass Coalition organized and hosted for Senator Markey, our Massachusetts senator, back in February, where Senator Markey, reaffirmed his commitment to abolish the filibuster. And he recommended to us, all the Indivisibles from around the state that were on the call that night, to read the book, Kill Switch, The Rise of the Modern Senate and the Crippling of American Democracy. So if he hadn't recommended that book to us, Carla wouldn't have known to call. So you never know. Listen to your senators just like they have to listen to you. All right, so let's get started. Thank you very much, Adam, for writing this insightful book. It was very clear and a page-turner. from the beginning of the framers of the Constitution all the way to the dysfunctional modern Senate that we live with today. So most people are familiar with the filibuster from the perspective of Mr. Smith goes to Washington, some senator stands on the floor of the Senate and talks forever. Okay, however, in the book, Adam writes that the framers designed a Senate as a majority rule body. As he points out in his book, the word filibuster didn't exist in the language of the framers. However, the filibuster developed. It was first a talking filibuster, and now it's a silent one. So Adam, tell us, what's a filibuster, how to get started, and where are we today with this thing?
Absolutely. Thank you, Deb. Thank you for moderating. Thank you to the Book Festival for having me. It's really a pleasure. And thank you, Carla and Kathy, for getting me here. The filibuster, as you said, was not included in the original design of the Senate. And I think that's a really important point to grasp and hold on to here, because it's become such a fundamental part of our understanding, not just of the Senate, but of our entire government. I think if you know a very limited number of things about American civics, the filibuster might be one of those things. So it is a mutation that has come to define the chamber where it exists, and in many ways our system itself. So I think that is sort of a reflection of what's happened. Something that wasn't supposed to be there, that is a mutation, has now taken over the host being in many ways. And it's not that the framers didn't think of it. It's actually the opposite. They thought of it and were very clear that they did not want it to exist. So it wasn't an afterthought, it wasn't an omission, it was something that they very clearly considered and rejected entirely. They didn't have the word filibuster to describe it, because that word didn't come about until much later, reflecting how it didn't exist in the first place. But they could understand the idea of it, and they discussed it at length at the Constitutional Convention. They wrote about it at length in the Federalist Papers. And they were very clear that there should be no sort of supermajority threshold, not just in the Senate, but in anywhere in the decision-making apparatus of the US government. The reason that they were so focused on this question is that in the Articles of Confederation, which was American government version 1.0, they did put a supermajority threshold in Congress for most major pieces of legislation, on the theory that filibuster defenders use to defend it today, on the theory that a higher threshold would facilitate compromise and consensus and generally be a force for moderation. All good things, well-intentioned legislative design. But what they found in practice under the Articles of Confederation was that the exact opposite happened, and that rather than promoting consensus and compromise, the supermajority threshold promoted gridlock, and it empowered the side that was in the numerical, I'm going to say minority a lot here. What I mean when I say minority is numerical minority, whoever is on doesn't have as many votes as the other side. So a supermajority threshold, rather than promote compromise and consensus, empowered the minority in any given debate to impose gridlock and to just try to make the majority look bad. And this was a disaster under the Articles of Confederation that led to many major crises. And so by the time they got around to writing the Constitution, they had had firsthand experience with what government looks like when you have a supermajority threshold, and they were very clear that they did not want this to happen again. So, I was surprised when I started doing the research about how unambiguous this is, because you hear a lot of talk about James Madison and protection of minority rights when you talk about the filibuster. But Madison was the leader of the opposition to the idea of a supermajority threshold. It's his notes on the Constitutional Convention that we rely upon and the historians rely upon, and he was adamant throughout the process. He did believe in the protection of minority rights, but only up to a point, and that's what gets lost in the certain debate in the debate today. He believed that the minority had a right to have its say, to have input in legislation. The Senate was designed to promote, small states and make them equal to big states, which is actually something Madison opposed to, but that's another story. He was from a big state, Virginia, so he was somewhat biased on that question. He didn't want Delaware to have the same number of votes as Virginia, but we won't get into that. But it sort of underscores the point of how limited his appreciation for minority rights was. And so, it's very consistent in his notes on the Constitutional Convention, in his writings in the Federalist Papers, in Hamilton's writings in the Federalist Papers. Again and again, they raise the arguments that people make in defense of a supermajority threshold and then knock them all down one by one and come to the conclusion that at the end of the day, when minority rights ran up against the principle of majority rule, the minority should have their say, they should have a long time to discuss, all that stuff. But when push came to shove and the two came into conflict, majority rule should win every single time. So this was not a close call. This was something that they were very clear about, and something that Madison, who was one of the youngest framers and lived for a while and had a long career in government after writing the Constitution or being the secretary of the convention, he was consistent throughout his entire career on this. Never wavered, always came down in favor of majority rule, even as the filibuster started to come into existence later in the 19th century.
Okay, so how did it come into existence? What caused that to happen?
So obstruction is nothing new. It's been around forever. It was in the Roman Senate. It's been in every legislative body. I mean, it's people are creative about how to stop things that they don't want to happen. And so two things happened. One is that a lot of the rules and norms that the Senate put in place to prevent something like the filibuster from coming into existence started to be weakened over the course of the early 19th century. So, when I say they didn't want the filibuster, and they wrote about it in the Federalist Papers, they wrote about it in the Constitutional Convention, they also put rules in place to prevent it. Like, they were very clear they didn't want this thing to exist. This is not just a matter of philosophy, it was a matter of practice. So in the early Senate, there were limits on how long you could debate. And most importantly, there was a rule on the books that said that if a debate went on for too long, a majority of senators could vote to cut it off. They rarely used this rule because they had a lot of other norms and practices that stopped senators from debating too long. It was just considered to be beneath the dignity of a senator to do that. The idea was you would get up and you would give your speech and you would have your say and you could even speak at great length, but at the point at which you start to veer into obstruction rather than persuasion, senators would just start talking over you. There were only about 26 senators in the body at this time, so it wasn't very big. And if people in the room started to get antsy, you could tell. They would just start talking over you. They would open the doors to the chamber. There were all these things they would do. But if none of that worked, they had a rule that they could invoke to cut the person off on a majority rule vote and then bring the bill up for a vote also at a majority threshold. In 1806, they got rid of that rule almost by accident. This rule was called the previous question rule. And it's actually a very common rule in most legislatures around the world, in state legislatures. Previous question refers to the bill on the floor. It's let's get to the question. It's basically the idea behind the rule. In 1806, the Senate was undergoing its third impeachment trial. This was of Samuel Chase, and it was the most contentious impeachment that America had faced to date. The first two were relatively open and shut cases of treason and drunkenness. This one was more fraught. It was about, could you be impeached for being too partisan, essentially? And so it carried a lot of political implications. Aaron Burr was the vice president at the time, and as such, he was president of the Senate. He oversaw this impeachment trial, and he did so very well, and everybody's very pleased with his handling of the trial. But in his conduct of the trial, he found that in the act of presiding, the Senate's rules were all over the place. They were written in different places, and it made it difficult to be the presider. And so he said to the Senate, he gave this big, glorious speech at the end of the trial about the greatness of the Senate, and everybody was, congratulating each other over how great they were. And then Burr said, by the way, here are some recommendations for basically cleaning up your rule books and streamlining things and putting them all in one place. And one of the recommendations was to get rid of this previous question rule because nobody ever used it. It was such an established norm that you would not use debate to obstruct that they were like, you don't need this, it's beneath your dignity, just get rid of it. It's not going to ever need to come into play. So perhaps the most consequential copy edit in American history, and underscoring just how much of an afterthought it was. It's not like they got rid of that rule and then all of a sudden people started using the filibuster. It took another 25 or 30 years for people to realize that this loophole had been created and to start exploiting obstruction that this loophole had allowed. So they got rid of it, no one really noticed, and then a man named John Calhoun came to the Senate. I'll stop there because I suspect that might be part of your next question.
No, it's not, so go ahead.
Oh,
Go
okay.
ahead, finish your thought.
I also just needed a drink. Loopholes are loopholes. They exist on the books for a long time, and sometimes they're never discovered, and it takes a certain kind of person to come along and figure out how to exploit those loopholes. So John Calhoun was that person. He wasn't the first to use what we would sort of today describe as the filibuster. There were sort of scattered instances of obstruction and people using something that could kind of be loosely defined as a filibuster before him. But what he was the first to really do was to marry the particular kind of obstruction that today is called the filibuster, giving long speeches, with the principle of minority rights. And to fuse those two things together into something that was bigger and powerful and that proved to be very lasting. And the reason that that fusion mattered was that there were all kinds of obstruction that were practiced in the Senate and in the House throughout the 19th century. And eventually, many rules were passed to get rid of all these different kinds of obstruction and to sort of write them out of the rules. But the filibuster was durable because it had this connection to this grandiose principle of minority rights. But from the beginning, when John Calhoun was invoking the filibuster on behalf of minority rights, what he was really talking about was not some besieged or vulnerable minority. He was the senator from South Carolina, and his principal patrons and the folks on behalf of whom he did virtually everything in political life when he was in the Senate were slaveholders of the South and the nascent Confederacy that was forming. And so when he was talking about preserving minority rights, he was talking about preserving the rights of the powerful white supremacist class of the South.
Right. Okay. So that leads into my next question. So what's happened is many now recognize the filibuster as a racist tool and a Jim Crow relic. So tell us more about why is it a Jim Crow relic?
Absolutely. So what Calhoun did was he, in the name of promoting the interests of his constituents in South Carolina, the plantation class, he innovated what we today would describe as the talking filibuster, which you mentioned before. Yep. This is Jimmy Stewart on the Senate floor, talking for a long time. Because all through the 19th century and into the 20th, there was no rule. The Senate was still a majority rule body, and I just want to emphasize that. Even as the filibuster started to develop, every single bill that came before the Senate was passed or failed on a majority rule basis. There was simply, with few exceptions that are in the Constitution for treaties, impeachment, and a few other things, everything else, all regular business was majority rule. So when you think of the golden era of the Senate, and you think of all of the Missouri Compromise squeaked by a margin of 2 votes. If there had been a supermajority threshold, the Missouri Compromise never would have passed. So you name it, if it passed before 1917, it passed on a majority rule vote in the Senate. So what Calhoun did was he forged the talking filibuster. That was the best he could do with the tools available to him.
Right.
So senators would talk at great length. They could use it to back the majority up against a deadline. They could sort of force the majority to choose between their priorities because everybody wanted to get out of town. So you had to pass this bill or that bill because they took up all the time. It was a very useful tool, but it was really no more than a nuisance. It didn't kill any bills throughout the entire 19th century because eventually the minority would yield. And those norms that were in place at the beginning of the Senate still held very firm. There was one big debate over a bill to make Oregon a territory in 1848. And of course, like everything, this was infused with the issue of slavery, and the Southerners, led by Calhoun, were filibustering this bill because this bill would have made Oregon a free territory. But after the filibuster had been going on for several weeks, what happened was the majority proved that they had the votes to pass it on a majority, and Calhoun's allies in this filibuster all said, okay, we should stop now. Because in keeping with Senate tradition, when the majority is able to rule, the majority should rule. And Calhoun tried to get them to keep going and got very upset about it, but they folded their tents and the filibuster ended and this bill passed on a majority vote. The Jim Crow era started in 1877 with the end of Reconstruction, as everybody knows, and throughout this era, the filibuster started to become something different. And so when people call it a Jim Crow relic, they're being entirely historically accurate. Because what we think of as the modern filibuster today is the use of a supermajority threshold.
Right.
And that is what came into play in the Jim Crow era. This happened in 1917. They introduced a rule on the Senate books called Rule 22 that is the rule that today is used to apply a supermajority threshold. They did this with the intent of giving senators tools to end filibusters, not to prolong them.
Another loophole.
It was another well, yes, exactly. This was, talk about unintended, first you have a loophole, now you have unintended consequences. This was something that was invented to say, the rule that I mentioned in the previous question motion, which would allow you to cut off filibuster majority vote, Rule 17 was supposed to be that, but at a supermajority threshold. The committee that developed the rule couldn't get consensus to make it a majority threshold. They had a majority of the committee in favor of a majority threshold, but since they couldn't get consensus, they set it at a supermajority threshold. But the idea was that on any given issue, there would always be a supermajority of senators who could come together and say, okay, this debate has gone on long enough. We veered from persuasion into obstruction, so let's end this debate and bring this bill up to pass on a majority vote threshold. What happened, though, during this era was that Southern senators who were self-avowed white supremacists, I don't use that term lightly, but this is how they describe themselves,
Right.
They started to use this rule and combine it with their enormous power in the Senate. The Southern bloc during this period was by far the most powerful bloc in the Senate. They were in control of all of the major committees. So when they wielded power, senators listened, and going up against them and opposing them was a very bad career move for senators of the time because they could wreck your career with barely by lifting a finger. What they did is they started to use this new rule to effectively impose a supermajority threshold only on civil rights bills. Civil rights bills started to pass the House of Representatives during this period by enormous margins and come over to the Senate where they had majority support. And in many cases, they had presidents of both parties. Actually, Republicans were much better on civil rights during this time than Democrats were. All of the Southern senators at this time were Democrats. So the only thing standing in between these civil rights bills becoming law as early as the 1920s was this new invention of a supermajority threshold after 1917. And I think sometimes we tell ourselves, one of the many myths we tell ourselves about the filibuster is that there is some wisdom in delay, and that sometimes it delays bills for becoming law until the public is ready for them, something along those lines. I think that's a rationale that's often used to explain why we didn't pass a civil rights bill until the 1960s, or a major civil rights bill. But that's just simply not true.
Right.
Not only were these bills passing the House of Representatives by wide margins, they had enormous public support. And when I refer to these bills, I'm talking about bills to end lynching, bills to end poll taxes, and bills to end workplace discrimination. The country was ready for these bills as early as the 1920s. We know this because the Gallup organization came into existence in the 1930s. And in 1937, Gallup polled the American people on whether they supported federal anti-lynching laws. And they found 72% of the American people in support of federal anti-lynching laws, including a majority in the South. They polled the American people on anti-poll tax laws, and they found upwards of 60% of the American people in support of anti-poll tax laws. Everybody was ready for these except for a minority in the Senate. But because they twisted this new rule into a de facto supermajority threshold, they were able to block these civil rights bills for the entirety of the Jim Crow era. And from 1877 until 1964, the only bills that were blocked and stopped conclusively by the filibuster were civil rights bills.
Right.
So it was entirely accurate. When President Obama calls it a Jim Crow era, he is being
Spot on.
not just rhetorically effective, but spot on in terms of accuracy.
So let's switch a little bit and talk about, since you mentioned 1964, pick up there and backtrack just a tiny bit. Tell us briefly about the role that Senator Lyndon Johnson had in shaping the Senate as we see it today.
So Lyndon Johnson is a fascinating character. To gain the power that he wielded, he had to do something very difficult, which was to rise quickly in the Senate, which is not something that it's hard to do today, but back then it was almost impossible. He was elected to the Senate in 1948. He became minority leader by 1952, which was virtually unheard of. Part of the reason that was possible is that nobody wanted the job. The job of majority, the Speaker of the House is a role created in the Constitution. It's always existed. The Senate was supposed to be a leaderless body, and they did not have the position of majority or minority leader until the 1920s. And at that point, it was invented almost as a secretarial role, someone to sort of keep track of party business and loosely organize business on the floor. But the real power lay with the Southern Bloc. And so the de facto leader of the Senate at the time that Johnson arrived was a senator named Richard Russell of Georgia, who was the sort of recognized master of the Senate. He served on many important committees, but just generally was known to be the power behind the throne. And so if you wanted to be majority leader, you had to get Russell's backing. But it was not a great job because you only had as much leash as Russell was willing to give you. And he had a history of sort of humiliating people in that position when they stepped out of line and reminding everybody who was boss. So by the time Johnson got there, he had just seen the previous majority leader be completely humiliated by Russell in a big fight with the Truman administration. So he didn't even know if he wanted the job. But he got Russell's backing. And he got Russell's backing by, he's from Texas, which was not considered necessarily part of the Southern Bloc. You sort of had to prove yourself, if you were from Texas, that you were a true Southerner. And the way you proved yourself was to defend the filibuster. And so Johnson's maiden speech in the Senate in 1949 was an elaborate defense of the filibuster. And he gave it to Richard Russell beforehand and to read. And Richard Russell told all the Southern senators to come to the floor and watch this rising young star. And he gave this elaborate defense of the filibuster. He went so far as to say that if he could give one gift to the countries behind the Iron Curtain, it would be the gift of unlimited debate in their legislative chambers, which I suspect is probably not what they would have wanted. But but so Johnson basically aligned himself closely with Russell. Through his support, he rose to the job of leader. But he had to do this delicate dance throughout the 1950s to maintain the support of the Southern Bloc, which was his power base. But he was also trying to make himself nationally appealing as a presidential candidate.
Right.
And the Democratic Party at that time was divided between the Southern wing and the rising liberal wing. And so he had to do this thing where he had to try to pass civil rights while also defending the filibuster. And so what you had out of that process was the 1957 Civil Rights Bill, which passed, but only because Johnson completely gutted it to the point that it was satisfied that the Southerners were willing to let it pass because it was so toothless.
Right.
And a very interesting thing that happened in 1957 was that you had that year kick off. So Dwight Eisenhower had built a better record on civil rights than any prior Democratic administration. And Republicans were making a very strong play for the African-American vote in 1956. In 1956, Dwight Eisenhower was endorsed by the NAACP, by Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, who represented Harlem, by Jackie Robinson, and many other major black leaders. And Eisenhower won 40% of the black vote, which was the highest a Republican has won in a century. Yeah. And part of the reason he won it was because Eisenhower and his vice president, Richard Nixon, were going around the country promising to get rid of the filibuster and pass a strong civil rights bill. You had one campaign event in Harlem where Nixon was campaigning in Harlem with Adam Clayton Powell and members of the NAACP, promising to get rid of the filibuster and pass a strong civil rights bill over Democratic opposition.
Wow.
And then in 1957, the year opened with Nixon presiding over the Senate as vice president, teaming up with major Senate liberals like Hubert Humphrey to try to abolish the filibuster over the opposition of Lyndon Johnson, who was the Democratic Senate leader. So this is how scrambled party politics were at the time.
So jump forward a little bit, and now LBJ is the president, and it's 1964, and he's trying to pass a civil rights bill with teeth in it.
Right.
And the filibuster comes up.
That's right.
Tell us what happened with that filibuster.
So, LBJ sort of had a Damascus conversion as when he became president. And, to his credit, I mean, the guy was a virulent racist. I mean, the stories about him are terrible. But he always did have, as Robert Caro lays out in his biographies, a real love for the underdog. And, that in some ways led him to seize on civil rights. There was also an element of competition with the Kennedy administration. Kennedy administration sort of begrudgingly advanced a civil rights bill in 1963 after the murder of James Meredith. After James Meredith was from the University of Mississippi, I'm thinking of the NAACP leader who was murdered. And so, the Kennedy administration put the civil rights bill forward, but then was happy to let it die. And their big priority domestically was a tax cut bill. Wow. And they were happy to let the civil rights bill get stuck in the committee of Harry Byrd, who was on the finance committee, and let it go. Johnson, when he became vice president after Kennedy was assassinated, his advisors gave him the same advice and said, don't do civil rights, it's a loser. you won't win. And Johnson turned to them and said, well, what the hell is the presidency for? And he intervened personally to get the tax cut bill that was stuck in Harry Byrd's committee freed. That came to the floor. That cleared the way for the Civil Rights Bill to come up. And then you had one of the longest filibusters in Senate history. This was not an individual filibuster. This was a team filibuster.
How long did it take?
It took 3 months.
3 months. 3 months of debate on the floor?
That's right.
Real debate.
Real debate. And it was the only thing on the floor at the time. And it was 3 months of wrangling, of angling for the votes. People say today, how can we, get the votes to do filibuster reform? And the answer at the end of the day is just relentless pressure. And that's what Johnson did in 1964. He did something that his advisors told him was impossible, which was to break a Southern filibuster on civil rights.
Right.
And it was just relentless pressure from him. He was working in concert not just with the Democratic leader, Mike Mansfield, but the Republican Senate leader, Everett Dirksen, who was also helping him. And it took the president, the Democratic Senate leader, and the Republican Senate leader all working together to break the Southern filibuster over the period of 3 months.
So before we turn it over to questions, what do you think Biden should do now?
Well, it is very tricky. And I think in a lot of ways, the politics of this moment now do mirror the politics of 1964, where, reforming the filibuster and passing voting rights is something that a lot of his political advisors are probably telling him is impossible. And of course, he's got the challenge of at least 2 Democratic senators who are very stubbornly opposed to it.
Right.
But Biden has some unique credibility on this issue, and he has the ability to be sort of a Nixon goes to China on the filibuster. And I think that if he ever decided that it was really in his interest and something that he wanted to happen to reform the filibuster, he has unique credibility to go to senators like Manchin and Sinema and tell them that, if it wasn't necessary, he wouldn't be asking them to do this because he loves the Senate, he loves the institution, and he would never do anything to harm it. But that at least for the purpose of passing voting rights, which the filibuster has historically been used to defeat, some sort of reform is necessary. And I think we have to get past this infrastructure debate and the reconciliation debate in order for the White House to be able to dedicate the amount of bandwidth it would take to this. But given the threat to our democracy that we face today, I think this is something that he has to take very seriously.
Quickly.
And we see him putting a tremendous amount of personal capital into the infrastructure debate. So it is possible to do this if a president decides, and I think he needs to apply some fraction of that amount of capital to the cause of voting rights and the reform necessary to get it there.
Right. As I've heard, we need infrastructure for our democracy, and that means voting rights.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, okay, so let's leave that right there. And does anybody have a question? Does anybody want to come up to the mic? Yes, please, go first.
So, Adam, you just did a fabulous job of explaining this topic and this book to us, and I just want to encourage you to just rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat.
Thank you.
Next suggestion is go to Netflix and do Kill Switch, subtitled Mr. Gentleson Goes to Washington. I'm a C-SPAN junkie for decades, okay, and there is this iron curtain of information about what goes on in detail, also known as into the weeds, God forbid, okay? And we want to know these details because they're crucial to understanding where we really are. And people like us are not used to not knowing what's going on because we do our homework. But when there's no one to explain it, we're left in the dark. So, just one more question. You must have done research when you started the project, like all nonfiction authors do, more or less, to see, had anyone else ever done this before? Or is this literally the first imprint on the filibuster at this level of detail and sophistication?
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. So no one had written the history of the Senate in the same way. I think prior to basically the turn of the 20th century, and really the turn of the 21st century, most Senate history is very sort of self-congratulatory and glorifying. There were sort of journalistic books. Citadel by Walter White, who's the New York Times Senate correspondent, is a very good book. but they were long out of print and very wrapped up in sort of perpetuating the myths of the Senate, and so no one had ever written a book that tries to take a more critical approach. And that was reflective of my experience there, where I came in with a lot of respect for the institution, and still have a fair amount. But it is, if you excuse the term, it is an institution that is sort of critically enamored of its own bullshit, and it to an extent that's really unhealthy for it. It just believes its own hype, and I wanted to try to cut through that. There's a tremendous amount of political science research in this field, and that's something I relied on tremendously for the book. Work by Sarah Binder, who's at Brookings, has been absolutely critical. She wrote a book in the 90s called Politics or Principle that was sort of set the parameters of the debate on filibuster reform, and really sort of was one of the first books to really take it on critically and show the damage that it was doing. But these are academic books written for a different audience, extremely valuable, but not an attempt to communicate with a wider audience. So, that had not been attempted before. And as I was telling Deb, I thought it would be too boring, but I had a wonderful editor at Norton who was confident that we could build a compelling narrative out of it. So that's how it came to be.
Thanks. Go ahead. Next question.
Thank you so much for your talk and for your work. If the intent of the framers is as clear and unambiguous as you say it is, why is this not a legal question as much as a political one? What about a lawsuit to establish the proposition that supermajority rule is unconstitutional?
That's a very good question, and those lawsuits do exist. There's some excellent work by legal scholars. Jason Chaffetz at Duke University is one. And the theory is, as you suggest, that the filibuster is unconstitutional. Because what it does, by imposing a supermajority threshold on one part of the government, it is effectively changing the entire structure of our system of government. Because if one chamber changes its rules in a way that affects every other part of the government, it has sort of unilaterally changed the system. And so, if you have a supermajority threshold in the Senate, every bill that becomes a law has to pass through that supermajority threshold. So you're effectively imposing a supermajority threshold on the House too. And so that's the legal argument, that it is unconstitutional because the framers designed a system that wasn't supposed to have any supermajority decision points, and they've changed that. So those lawsuits do exist. They have not had a great time in the courts, unfortunately. They've been tossed out, and I think, unfortunately, with the makeup of the Supreme Court such as it is right now, people are still fighting that battle. But for it to succeed, we'd probably have to get a balance of power shifted on the courts. But they're extremely good legal arguments on that score, and I think they're correct.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Adam, for your presentation. The argument that I hear most often in opposition to the elimination of the filibuster is what might be called the "be careful what you wish for" argument. That is, when the administration changes, what happens then? Would you please comment on that?
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that
Great.
up. I have two answers to that question. One is sort of my fluffy philosophical argument, but it's also about structural power, which is that if you look at this from a question of structural power, the filibuster is something that inherently benefits conservatives over progressives simply by the nature of the fact that it makes it harder to impose change. So if one side of the political world is trying to enact change and the other is trying to stop change, it empowers the right over the left. Now, of course, there are things that conservatives want to do that liberals will want to stop, and it has come in handy for liberals on several occasions, and I address some of that in the book. But when you step back and look at the balance of power, there's simply no question that if the filibuster had never existed, it would have overwhelmingly benefited liberals more than conservatives. Just to give a few examples, we're talking about black people in the South not being able to vote until the 1960s. At the time when anti-poll tax bills could have passed. Actually, there was a bill in 1891 that had the votes to pass and was scuttled by a filibuster. Mississippi, the population of Mississippi was 50% black. The population of the Carolinas was a third black. So if those populations had even a fraction of them had been actually able to exercise the right to vote starting at the turn of the century, the leadership of the South would have looked entirely different. So if you think of how our American history might have unfolded differently if there had never been a George Wallace or there had never been these Southern leaders, and Southern leaders actually had to be accountable to 50% of their population or state, structurally, I think things would have been very different. The Electoral College was, is that bad? That sounds bad. Okay. I'm not a vineyarder, so
It's 12 o'clock,
sirens
I guess.
scare me. I guess,
It's like,
that's
is it
normal,
bad?
yeah.
I think we're okay.
But another example is the Electoral College. In 1970, they came very close to eliminating the Electoral College, and it was scuttled by a filibuster. So if we'd gotten rid of the Electoral College in 1970, you wouldn't have had George W. Bush, you would not have had Donald Trump. Union organizing, you would not have right-to-work states if it weren't for the filibuster. There was an effort to repeal the section of the Taft-Hartley Act that creates the ability to impose right-to-work laws. There was an effort to repeal that in the 1960s that had passed the House and had the support of the majority of the Senate, was scuttled by a filibuster. So I'm talking about deep structural power distribution, and there's nothing remotely comparable on the conservative side. Overwhelmingly, liberals have been defeated by the filibuster. And then I'll just make a very practical political argument, which is that, if you don't get rid of the filibuster now, you are imposing an enormous upfront cost on liberal causes. You're going to not pass voting rights. You're going to not pass background checks, immigration laws, environmental provisions that are going to get struck out of reconciliation, the PRO Act to re-empower union organizing. So you're going to take that cost up front in order to preserve this defensive tool for yourself later. The problem with that calculation is that Republicans can just get rid of that defensive tool themselves once they're back in power. And so I think the worst case scenario is to sort of shoot ourselves in the foot up front by not passing these structural issues, and then have Republicans come in and just get rid of this tool that we kept in place.
Tried to play it safe.
Yeah, and I think that's what is likely to happen. I think if you think Mitch McConnell is going to stand on principle and preserve the filibuster, another way to put it is if any strategy that relies on forbearance in the future from Mitch McConnell is probably not a great strategy.
one,
So look,
right.
I mean, it's not to downplay the risk. There's absolutely risk in it. But I think if you look at it from a risk calculation strategy, progressives stand to gain more, and Republicans can just come along and get rid of it anyway when they feel like it. So I think it's not an easy choice, but that's why I come down on the side of getting rid of it consistently.
And so do I hear you saying your take is if the tables were reversed, McConnell would say, yeah, let's just get rid of it and let's do what we want to do?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. I mean, take voting rights, for example. If we did a carve out for voting rights, Kristen Sinema is running around saying, don't do it because Republicans will come in and impose national voting restrictions. I think Republicans, if we don't get rid of it, Republicans will come in and do their own carve out and impose national voting restrictions and voter ID anyway. So I just think it's a short-sighted view.
I have one last question, but first, the gentleman standing, please.
Thank you,
Oh,
Adam.
there's
Thank
more.
you
Sorry.
for your book and this presentation. My question is about the practice of putting forth votes that only come from a majority of the majority in the Senate. And is there anything that can be done to prevent that going forward?
Yeah, and there's been some great research on this. So the idea is, can you write a rule, or the way this sort of idea is digested in practice is, can you write a rule that says filibusters can go forth if the filibustering senators represent a majority of the population? So the reason this is coming to practice is that when Democrats waged filibuster, it's been shown that when Democrats have been in the minority, they represent a majority of the population. So Republicans in the Senate have not represented a majority of the population at any point since the turn of the century. Even when they've had as many as 55 seats in the Senate, they've represented less than 50% of the country. Today, in your evenly split Senate, the 50 seats that Democrats have represent 41 million more people than the 50 seats that Republicans have. So the idea is, can you do a filibuster if the senators, even if there are only 40 senators, represent a majority of the population? The answer is you can write the rules however you want. basically. If you wanted to have what they call majoritarian filibusters, that's what this would be called. You can write the rules. The Senate it's very Calvin ball in its rulemaking. They like to think that it's this austere body, but 51 senators can write the rules however they want. So you could do that if you wanted. You're only limited by the creativity of the smart parliamentarian lawyers who are writing the rule. But that is something that's being seriously discussed.
So what rule do you think you go through reforms? Which one reform would help get us back to a governing body of majority rule? 51 votes wins a day, as it should.
Yeah, I mean, I would basically, not to be an originalist, because I'm not, but I would reimpose the rule that was there in the first place is the easiest way to do
simple?
it. Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's there's value in the minority having the protections that they were supposed to have, which is the ability to debate bills at length, to have their say,
Persuade.
to persuade, and if you can persuade the other side to come around and you get more votes, then great.
Right.
So a rule that would allow that debate to take place, you could put a clock on it and say, 500 hours of debate or something. That's an idea that's being kicked around. But after that, a reasonable standard of debate is exhausted, the majority, if it's had the votes, would be able to cut off that debate and move it to a final vote. And the funny thing about this is that even today, bills pass or fail in the Senate on a majority vote. The vote to pass or fail a bill is still a simple majority. It's
And that
only this
can-
procedural vote that stands in the way.
So the filibuster is essentially just a procedural vote.
That's right. It's just a procedural vote. Everything that dies by filibusters is failing to get out of the debate stage, essentially.
Right. And so if you get that out of the way, things will pass by majority vote.
That's right.
51 votes wins a day, done. But
That's right.
they
When-
prevent that.
It's this rule from 1917 that prevents it.
Okay.
And so if you basically redid that rule but set it at a majority threshold, which is what they had originally, then I think you'd be
We'd be
fine.
good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I hope the senators are listening. So one other question, since a lot of us got here because we're grassroots organizers, what, from your experience in the Senate, what kind of impact do grassroots organizing and calling our senators and sending postcards and phone banking, what impact does that have? Any? Should we continue this?
I think it has enormous impact. And I think, look, I always think of the effort to stop the repeal of the Affordable Care Act in 2017. I think the grassroots was instrumental in making that happen and stopping that effort, which, by the way, was not stopped by a filibuster. It was stopped because they did repeal through the reconciliation process, so they only needed a majority to repeal, and it was their failure to get a majority to repeal that saved Obamacare, not the filibuster. On this issue in particular, I think grassroots has already had an enormous impact. Look, it's very frustrating that we don't have these last two senators on board, but in some ways this is sort of a first world problem, but it's demonstrates how much progress has been made, because I look at someone like Senator Klobuchar, who will be here tomorrow. During the Democratic primary, just less than a year ago, she was against the filibuster reform. The only people in favor of it were Elizabeth Warren and Julian Castro and Pete Buttigieg, and it was considered sort of a fringe left issue. Now, Senator Klobuchar is a champion for filibuster reform.
Yes.
And she represents the moderate wing of the party. So you look at that amount of progress in that short a time is an enormous amount of progress. We reformed the rules in 2013 when I worked for Senator Reid, and it took years to get there. So while it's discouraging that you have Manchin and Sinema going around defending this rule, I think grassroots organizers should be very happy that we have gotten ourselves up to the point where it's only a handful who are left opposing it. Because going into the year, I think you had like 15 votes or something for filibuster reform. So that's a tremendous amount of progress. And to get to 50, you first have to get to 45 and 46 and 48. And I think that's
Well, your book helped us.
Yeah.
Your
Well,
book
thank you.
helped us. Thank you.